Imagine living in a world where the law didn't just punish crime, it made an example out of your pain, where a single accusation could drag you from your home into a public square filled with cheering crowds, blazing fires, and devices designed not just to kill, but to terrify everyone watching into obedience. Because in ancient civilizations, punishment wasn't only about justice, it was about power, control, and fear so deep that entire societies were shaped by the screams of a few. And as shocking as it sounds today, many of these brutal methods were once considered completely normal, even necessary. From the scorching deserts of Persia to the crowded streets of medieval Europe and the disciplined empires of Rome and China, rulers believed that the harsher the punishment, the stronger the authority. And this belief created some of the darkest chapters in human history, where public executions became spectacles, torture chambers were architectural features of castles, and devices were engineered with chilling creativity, like the Iron Maiden, a metal coffin lined with spikes designed to pierce but not instantly kill, forcing victims into prolonged agony while onlookers absorbed the message loud and clear: disobedience had consequences. And then there was crucifixion, perfected by the Romans, a method so cruel that it combined exhaustion, exposure, and suffocation over hours or even days, turning roads into grim warnings lined with bodies as psychological warfare against rebellion. Yet what makes this history even more unsettling is not only the brutality itself, but how ordinary citizens often attended these punishments like entertainment, bringing families, food, and conversation as if witnessing suffering was just another weekend event. Because fear mixed with curiosity has always been a powerful social force, and governments understood this better than anyone, using spectacle to maintain order long before modern prisons or rehabilitation existed. While in parts of Asia, methods like Ling Chi, sometimes called death by 1,000 cuts, were meant to symbolize slow justice for severe crimes, reinforcing the idea that the punishment must reflect the gravity of the offense. And in medieval Europe, devices such as the breaking wheel shattered bones one by one before leaving victims exposed to the elements, not just ending a life, but turning it into a prolonged warning sign. Yet beyond the physical pain lay an even darker intention: humiliation, stripping individuals of dignity in front of their communities, ensuring their names would echo in shame long after death. And this psychological layer reveals something important about ancient societies. They didn't just fear crime, they feared disorder, rebellion, and the collapse of authority. So punishments evolved into theatrical displays designed to scare the population into compliance. And while modern audiences in the United States might view these acts as horrifying relics of a savage past, understanding them reveals how far legal systems have transformed and also how power has always shaped justice. Because even today, debates about punishment versus rehabilitation continue, just without the flames and iron cages. And when we study these ancient methods, we're not glorifying cruelty, but exposing the mindset of eras where survival of empires depended on visible dominance, where mercy was often seen as weakness and severity as strength. And the uncomfortable truth is that many innovations we celebrate from ancient civilizations, architecture, philosophy, governance, coexisted with practices that now shock our conscience, reminding us that progress is not linear, but layered with contradictions. And as you dive deeper into this shadowed side of history, you start to realize that these punishments were less about crime and more about sending a message, carving fear into collective memory so deeply that generations obeyed without question, which is why exploring these dark chapters isn't just about morbid curiosity, it's about understanding how humanity learned, slowly and painfully, that justice without compassion can become its own form of cruelty, and that the evolution from public torture to modern legal rights marks one of the most significant psychological shifts in civilization, a transformation driven not by sudden enlightenment, but by centuries of witnessing the consequences of unchecked authority, making the past both disturbing and essential to examine, because it shows exactly what happens when fear becomes the foundation of law and suffering becomes the language of power. As societies expanded and empires competed for dominance, punishments grew even more elaborate because rulers realized that fear traveled faster than armies. And in many regions, the purpose of cruelty was not simply to end a life, but to break the spirit of anyone who even imagined resisting authority, which is why execution grounds were often placed at city entrances or main crossroads, where travelers, merchants, and children alike would witness the consequences of defiance before even stepping inside the walls, creating a psychological barrier stronger than any gate or weapon. And in medieval England, hanging became a common sentence not only for murder, but sometimes for theft, with public gallows transforming into grim social gatherings where vendors sold food and spectators debated guilt or innocence as if it were a performance rather than a human life unfolding in front of them. While in other parts of Europe, punishments like drawing and quartering were designed to dismantle both body and identity, sending fragments of a person to different regions as a warning that betrayal would erase not only existence, but legacy itself. And this obsession with symbolic destruction shows how justice in those eras was deeply intertwined with political messaging rather than moral rehabilitation. Because prisons as we know them today were rare and expensive, and keeping someone alive without public suffering was often seen as wasted opportunity to reinforce power, which is why branding, mutilation, and forced labor were also widespread, leaving permanent marks that turned individuals into walking reminders of the state's authority. Yet what's even more chilling is how these methods were justified by the belief that pain purified society, that visible suffering somehow restored balance, a mindset rooted in fear of chaos more than desire for fairness. And when you shift your focus to ancient Asia and the Middle East, you see a different but equally intense pattern where punishments were frequently tied to honor. Religion or cosmic balance, reinforcing social hierarchies through strict codes that left little room for mercy. And although modern viewers in the United States might instinctively judge these practices as barbaric, it's important to recognize that these systems operated within the limited knowledge and cultural beliefs of their time, where medical understanding was minimal, communication slow, and maintaining order across vast territories required methods that were immediate and unforgettable. Yet even then, voices of opposition existed. Philosophers, scholars, and spiritual leaders who questioned whether cruelty truly created stability or simply bred resentment beneath the surface. And history shows that excessive brutality often led to uprisings rather than obedience, proving that fear can control crowds temporarily but rarely earns loyalty, which is why many empires that relied heavily on terror eventually faced revolutions fueled by the very pain they once used as a weapon. And this cycle reveals a deeper truth about human psychology. People may submit under extreme pressure, but the memory of injustice lingers longer than the fear of punishment, slowly shaping collective consciousness until change becomes inevitable. And when legal reforms finally began emerging centuries later, they were less about sudden compassion and more about practical realization that stability built on terror is fragile, expensive, and unsustainable, marking the beginning of a shift from spectacle to system, from public squares to courtrooms, from humiliation to documentation, a transformation that redefined authority not as the loudest display of power, but as the ability to maintain order without constant violence. And studying these transitions doesn't just expose the darkness of ancient punishments, it highlights the resilience of human societies to evolve, adapt, and eventually question the very traditions they once accepted without hesitation, reminding us that progress often begins when discomfort turns into reflection, and reflection turns into reform. Yet, even as legal systems slowly shifted away from open brutality, the shadow of ancient punishments continued to influence cultures for centuries, because fear leaves deep fingerprints on collective memory, and many early prisons were not places of rehabilitation, but extensions of the same philosophy. Dark, overcrowded cells where disease spread faster than hope,
proving that the transformation from spectacle to confinement did not instantly create humanity, it merely changed the scenery. And across continents, rulers still believed that harsh discipline forged stronger societies, so chains replaced cages, isolation replaced public humiliation, but the core idea that suffering could shape obedience lingered stubbornly. And when you examine historical records, you begin to notice how ordinary people adapted their behavior around these systems, teaching children obedience through stories of dungeons and executions, passing down warnings like inherited fears that became cultural traditions rather than legal realities. And this psychological inheritance is one of the most powerful yet invisible effects of ancient punishment, because it shaped morality not through education but through intimidation, embedding caution into daily life long after the original laws disappeared. While in the growing cities of the early modern world, the rise of written law, documentation, and structured courts marked a turning point where evidence slowly began replacing spectacle, and the focus shifted from punishing the body to controlling behavior, an evolution driven partly by economic logic, since injured or executed citizens could not contribute to labor or taxes, revealing that practicality often pushed reform just as much as compassion did. And as philosophies like human rights and individual liberty gradually spread, especially during Enlightenment movements, societies began questioning whether justice should protect power or protect people, a debate that reshaped entire nations and laid foundations for modern legal principles familiar to audiences in the United States today, such as due process, fair trials, and proportional sentencing. Yet the fascination with ancient punishments never fully vanished, because humans are naturally drawn to extremes, to the edges of what once was acceptable, and this curiosity fuels documentaries, museums, and historical discussions, not because we celebrate cruelty, but because we seek to understand how civilizations capable of art, science, and innovation also normalized unimaginable suffering. And this contrast forces a sobering realization that progress is not guaranteed, it is chosen repeatedly across generations, built from lessons learned through discomfort and reflection rather than comfort and ignorance. And when you step back and view the full arc of history, the darkest punishments become more than gruesome anecdotes. They become mirrors showing how power can distort justice when unchecked, and how societies slowly recalibrate their values through trial, error, and consequence, reminding us that modern laws did not appear overnight, but were carved out of centuries of debate, resistance, and reform. And perhaps the most important takeaway is not the devices or the executions themselves, but the evolution of empathy that followed, the gradual recognition that fear may enforce silence, but it never truly builds harmony, and that civilizations grow stronger not when they perfect punishment, but when they understand restraint, turning the study of these grim chapters into something unexpectedly meaningful, a reminder that humanity's greatest progress often comes from confronting its own darkest instincts and deciding, collectively, to move beyond them. And when you reach the later chapters of this long and uneasy journey, you begin to see that the legacy of ancient punishments didn't disappear. It transformed into warnings etched into culture, literature, and collective consciousness, shaping how future generations defined justice. Because every reform, every written constitution, every courtroom procedure was influenced in some quiet way by the memories of excess and imbalance that came before. And as societies entered the industrial age, the emphasis gradually shifted towards systems that aimed to correct behavior rather than publicly destroy individuals. Yet the fascination with dark history persisted, not out of cruelty, but out of a need to understand the boundaries humanity once crossed so easily. And this curiosity reveals something deeply human. We study the past not only to judge it, but to measure our own progress against it, to reassure ourselves that we have learned, even while knowing that power, fear, and control still exist in different forms. And when modern audiences in the United States watch documentaries or read accounts of medieval torture devices or ancient execution rituals, the reaction is often a mix of disbelief and reflection, because these stories challenge the comforting illusion that civilization has always been humane, exposing instead a slow, uneven evolution shaped by conflict, philosophy, economics, and courage from individuals who dared to question accepted norms. And what becomes clear is that justice is never static. It is a living concept constantly negotiated between authority and empathy, security and freedom.
Order and dignity and the darkest punishments of history serve as extreme reference points that help societies decide where those boundaries should stand, reminding us that laws are ultimately reflections of collective values rather than fixed truths. And as technology advanced, education expanded, and communication connected distant cultures, empathy began spreading faster than fear ever could, allowing reform movements to gain momentum and redefine what was acceptable, proving that while cruelty once traveled through spectacle, compassion eventually traveled through ideas, debates, and shared human experiences. And this shift marks one of the most profound transformations in human civilization, the realization that strength is not proven by the severity of punishment, but by the fairness of systems, that authority gains legitimacy not through intimidation, but through trust, and that the true measure of progress lies in how societies treat their most vulnerable moments, not their most powerful displays. So when we explore the grim corridors of ancient punishments today, we're not just looking at instruments of pain or shocking stories meant to disturb. We're examining milestones in the long process of moral development, understanding how fear once shaped order and how reflection slowly replaced terror as the guiding force of law, turning history's darkest practices into lessons that illuminate the path forward, reminding every generation that justice is not defined by how harshly it can strike, but by how wisely it can balance power with humanity.
And in the end, when all these dark chapters are placed side by side, what stands out isn't just the brutality of ancient punishments, but the uncomfortable truth that every civilization, no matter how advanced it believed itself to be, once stood at a crossroads between fear and fairness, often choosing fear because it was faster, louder, and easier to enforce. Yet history proves that while terror can silence voices for a moment, it cannot silence change forever. Because beneath every harsh law and every public execution, there were always whispers of doubt. Thinkers questioning whether suffering truly created order or simply delayed rebellion. And those whispers slowly turned into movements that reshaped entire legal systems, showing that progress is rarely born from comfort, but from confronting the consequences of excess. And when modern viewers look back from a world filled with courtrooms, written rights, and structured justice, the contrast feels almost unreal, as if humanity lived multiple lifetimes learning the same lesson again and again, that power without empathy eventually collapses under its own weight. And this realization is what makes the study of ancient punishments more than just dark curiosity. It becomes a mirror reflecting how far societies have traveled from spectacle to system, from intimidation to dialogue, from public fear to personal rights. And although modern justice is far from perfect, its existence is evidence of centuries of reflection, carved out of painful experiences that forced civilizations to evolve, reminding us that laws are not merely rules written on paper, but agreements shaped by collective memory, ethics, and the willingness to improve. So the true significance of these grim histories is not the devices, the executions, or the cruelty itself, but the transformation that followed, the gradual understanding that order built on terror is fragile, while order built on fairness endures, leaving us with a final thought that echoes through time. The darkest moments of history often become the foundations of humanity's brightest reforms. And the reason we continue to explore them is not to relive the horror, but to ensure that justice moves forward, guided by awareness rather than fear, proving that while the past cannot be changed, the future is always shaped by what we choose to learn from it.